Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Academy's webinar on guardrails and governance for the demonstration and deployment of emerging greenhouse gas removal approaches. My name is Holly Buck, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. I'm an associate professor with the Department of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Buffalo. And this conversation is the second of a three-part webinar series from the National Academies on foundations for a successful and responsible greenhouse gas removals ecosystem, sponsored by ClimateWorks Foundation. Today's speakers include Emily Grubert, University of Notre Dame, Jessica Smith, Colorado School of Mines, and Shuchi Talati, University of Pennsylvania. I'll let each speaker introduce themselves with their opening remarks. I'll offer some synthesizing thoughts, and then we'll move into a Q&A period. Audience members can submit questions for our panelists using the Slido interface on the webpage where this conversation is being live streamed. For those using the Slido app or website, the code is GHG Webinar 2, capital W. So I'll first turn it over to Emily.
Hey, everybody. I'm Emily Grubert. I'm at Notre Dame, like Holly just mentioned. I'm an associate professor here of sustainable energy policy and spend a lot of time thinking about fossil phase out and what that means for actually reaching some of our decarbonization targets. It's really a pleasure to spend part of your afternoon or morning or whatever time it is for you together today. And what I wanted to start out with is just talking a little bit about what carbon dioxide removal is, why we care about governance, and basically hopefully set the stage a bit for our other speakers today to explain where we're going. One of the things that I think is really critical to know about carbon dioxide removal, at least the way that I think about it, and I think the way that a lot of us look at it analytically, is that it's more a climate function rather than a technology or an industry or something like that. It is those other things as well. But when we think about where we're going in terms of decarbonization and really trying to address climate change and some of the impacts that might be reversible, it's something that really characterizes a functionality that isn't provided via a lot of the other kinds of things that we tend to think about in the decarbonization space. So like renewable energy or efficiency and things like that. Those things can make it so that we're emitting less greenhouse gas to the atmosphere, but it isn't until you start talking about carbon dioxide removal and potentially some other forms of greenhouse gas removal that we're really talking about taking greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere out. So from that perspective, it's a really critically important function that is a big part of the way that we think about what long-term decarbonization strategies and climate mitigation strategies might look like, in that it is the way that we achieve negative emissions. Why is that important from a governance perspective? I think the point that I'd like to leave you with mostly is that because of this status as a suite of technologies and an emerging industry and all of those other things that is also a critical climate function, this is something that we can't just kind of let evolve in the same way that we would a typical industry that's providing something that maybe can be provided by other means. And so in thinking carefully about what we need out of carbon dioxide removal from a long-term climate perspective, there's a real call, I think, to think about governance much more carefully than, say, I don't know, how we regulate grocery stores or something like that, which is also super important. But this is the kind of situation where it's an entirely new function that doesn't really necessarily have a lot behind it yet. I think that's the second point that I'd really like to make right up front, is that we are in a really important moment here in that we understand that carbon dioxide removal is likely necessary to achieve the kinds of international climate targets that we've set as a global community, mostly because we have not mitigated fast enough. So we're in a situation where there's quite a lot of emissions that are ongoing and quite a lot of legacy emissions that do need to be addressed. That wasn't necessarily always the case, but it probably is now. But thinking about reaching net zero and net negative long term, we probably do need some form of carbon dioxide removal. At the same time, this is not something that really exists yet. So there are a bunch of pilot plants. There are some that we might even go so far as to say demonstrations. There are some that are sort of semi-commercial. I've been a Climeworks customer for like 5 or 6 years at this point. So there are some places where you can engage in this industry, but as a thing that has a lot of existing companies and existing frameworks, existing regulatory structures. We're not really there yet. And so we're at this point where there's this massive thing that we probably need to be thinking about as a global community for the long term in order to achieve climate goals that also doesn't really have a set of existing infrastructures and existing governance structures and things like that. Therefore, I think we're at a really important moment for thinking about how we want to govern this and what we want out of it. I think the third major point that I'll make, and really looking forward to Q&A as well, is that part of the huge reason that I would argue that we need to be attentive to governance, maybe more than we need to be attentive to technology at this point, is because we understand when looking at the kind of suite of things that we think can achieve carbon dioxide removal, that this is likely a limited resource. I think a lot of the time in public, people talk about it like, well, there's so much CO2 in the atmosphere, we're not going to run out. And by the time that that's limiting, we'll have solved the problem. So that's not a big deal. What that doesn't consider is things like energy use for some of the more technological pathways that we think about for carbon dioxide removal, land use for many of the more biologically mediated routes and so forth. But there's not an infinite amount of capacity to do carbon dioxide removal. We also know that there are probably different ways that you can interpret what emissions maybe will continue. So in the residual emission space, what you actually need to offset with carbon dioxide removal and how much you might want to actually remove from legacy emissions. Given that this is a limited resource, that there are disagreements about how much needs to happen, there's a really important resource allocation question that's emerging that really points to the need for significant governance. So this is something where governance is really important. We're not really at a point where we have large and long established firms and things like that that have existing structures and existing things that they're plugging into, and it's a limited resource with huge resource allocation questions. So I will turn it back to Holly and look forward to the Q&A.
Great, thank you. Jessica?
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and be able to spend this time thinking with you all. So my name is Jessica Smith. I am an anthropologist and Dean's Fellow for Earth and Society programs at the Colorado School of Mines. I'm also a professor in our Engineering, Design, and Society department. Where I'd like to complement our panel is to share some of our on-the-ground, place-based research and perspectives from our attempts to design, develop, and implement a more responsible geologic CO2 storage system in southern Colorado. So I spent the last 3 years thinking deeply about the social dimensions of successful carbon storage projects as part of a DOE-funded feasibility study. And through that work have really benefited greatly from other social scientists who've been working on other DOE projects, especially related to direct air capture. And so in terms of my own background, I came to this work after spending almost 2 decades studying corporate community relationships in the mining and oil and gas sectors. And while these industries are different in terms of their footprints, their politics, and their histories, I remain struck by the many similarities that exist in terms of opportunities and challenges. And in our own project, we've taken lessons from these other industries and tried to apply them to our own work in order to create more mutually successful outcomes for both the project and for the region. And a clear main lesson has been the need for early engagement to help align industry practice with community values and goals. So concretely for us, what that meant was developing a social science research agenda that would inform both the project planning in general, as well as the more operational outreach that was being done by our potential commercial operator. So our goal was really to understand from the ground up how people in the region were already thinking about and planning for their future, and already thinking about and planning for the role of energy in that future, which would help us understand whether and how and under what circumstances carbon storage could fit into those futures that were already being made. So we had a postdoc named Vivian Underhill, a PhD student named Nico Pesci, a master's student named Emily Cicchini, and an undergraduate student named Olivia Dietrich. And we all really immersed ourselves in the region. What became clear is that people were evaluating this potential carbon storage hub in terms of these longer industrial histories that they'd already dealt with. And in that case, it was steel as well as coal-fired electricity generation. So we read everything we could about local history, from academic books to oral histories. We did a lot of ethnographic research. We spent time with community-based organizations who were actively planning for the future and thinking about energy in a way that would help to right past wrongs. We also spend a lot of time with and listening to the people who are closest to the potential well site about what they really loved, about what they lived, about where they lived, and what their main concerns were, including relative to our project. And I'll be happy to share more details in the Q&A later, but the idea of this research was to be able to open up a potential carbon storage system, and design it in a way that we could think about which parts we could modify in order to increase alignment with community concerns and priorities. We also did something that anthropologists call studying up. So we interviewed carbon management professionals about their own careers and their own views of industry. So this included, but wasn't limited to, those who are working with us on our own project. And what this helped us do was identify gaps between how they were thinking about risks, and how our community stakeholders were thinking about risks. It also importantly helped us identify some common grounds in terms of values. So for example, we found the most agreement about carbon management being prioritized for hard to abate sectors like cement, rather than power generation, which I think fits with the theme of this webinar. And both groups cared a lot about addressing climate change. However, in general, the STEM professionals viewed kind of carbon storage as a tool in the toolbox to mitigate climate change, whereas most of our community groups found it to be a more distracting technology if it wasn't applied correctly. And so the primary value of this research wasn't just changing how we communicated about the project, but how we really thought about it and developed it. And so then finally, we also wanted to use the social science research to address process and governance. So this region has been a hotbed of clean energy prospecting. In one area, there have been multiple DOE awards made, but there's also been a lot of industry decarbonization work on its own, and task forces and kind of their opposition movements. And so we committed to setting up an advisory board that would be the entity that would channel feedback from the region to the project and then make recommendations about paths forward, including whether we'd be signing legal agreements. And what was really helpful in our work is that we had a project lead from Mines named Dr. Manika Prasad, who's a geophysicist, who really saw the importance of getting the social dimensions right for the overall success of the project. We also had a commercial developer that wanted to do carbon management differently, and were willing to think outside of the box in order to do so. And we also had institutional backing of our original community benefits plan, which provided a budget and enforceable milestones rather than treating some of these social questions as optional add-ons. Currently, the funding uncertainties that many of us have been managing have impacted our project as well as many others. And kind of funding and these other uncertainties are really difficult, prevent some challenges for building trust and relationships, because these really require consistency at a very basic level, doing what you say you're going to do and staying in touch. And I think this underlines the need for more durable policy that can provide a foundation for projects in the long term. And I look forward to our discussion about potential next steps forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Shuchi now.
Thanks, Holly, and thanks so much to the National Academies for having me. So just to briefly introduce myself again, I'm the executive director of an organization called the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering, where I focus on the governance and justice dimensions of another emerging technology in solar geoengineering. Prior to DSG, I was helping lead the CDR portfolio at the Department of Energy in the Biden administration alongside Emily and Holly. And it was here that I think, a lot of, how I think about CDR and kind of these first national considerations of CDR taking shape have really influenced how I think about CDR governance. And governance is really the essential underlying foundation for how any decision gets made. And I think naming that definition is also really critical to this discussion. So kind of to take a step back, governance focus on actions that steer or influence how decisions are made. It's a really simple definition, but I think important to kind of focus on for kind of the ways that I think about this space. And so to kind of look at that a little more carefully, that means governance is both activity to stop bad things from happening, but also activities to enable better versions of action. And I think this is really important because governance isn't inherently good or inherently bad. And I would argue that bad or problematic governance around climate is actually what we've seen a lot more of. And so this kind of political context for decision making is critical to this conversation. How we build technologies is impossible to consider without the context of who is making decisions and to what end. And so kind of in this vein, I think it's really helpful to name kind of why we need good governance for CDR. And so, first to reiterate what Emily said, CDR is limited. It's extremely expensive. And so building CDR in the context of decisions around other parts of the climate portfolio will be really essential to its success. Second, governance is the framework that we can build to make sure CDR actually serves the needs that we want it to, like addressing hard to abate or legacy emissions. And lastly, governance is critical to making sure CDR can help justice considerations and not exacerbate harm. The scale of this, I think, goes from both local to international scales, where you have communities near potential projects, but also climate vulnerable countries and communities whose futures are dependent on the choices that are currently made in very narrow and elite circles without their perspectives. And the last thing I'll name before passing it back to Holly is that, and to build on some of the points that Jessica and Emily made, is that governance requires resources. It's not cheap. It takes time, it takes man hours, it takes ideation and implementation. And these are really complicated things to think about. And so when we think about how to build governance, kind of where those decisions get made and ultimately who get to make them, that takes engagement, capacity building, civil society, academia, to all have the resources to participate and ultimately implement. And so I just wanted to name that to close out my remarks.
Wonderful, thank you. I wanted to start off by asking about early engagement, which Jessica mentioned, and we've probably all talked about several times. People ask how early is early? When does this engagement need to begin? And more broadly, what insights do you have on navigating this tension between the speed for research, development, deployment on climate solutions and the time needed for appropriate and thoughtful governance approaches? People often talk about doing engagement or governance at the speed of trust, and yet we are feeling this time pressure to deploy. So maybe we can start with you, Emily, on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think I am going to be a little bit of an academic here for a second and just say that, like, the more that I think about this, I think it actually really is very, very important to do real consultation with people about what the purpose of CDR is way upstream, like not at the project level. And I think that this kind of comes into the point about CDR being relatively limited. I think we're going to have much more success with actually seeing CDR deployed in a way that's useful and is compatible with climate targets if we kind of agree on what those are. Transition is normative, deployment of resources is normative, resource allocation in general is normative. And I think that by the time you're talking about a project, there are obviously things that need to be really significant points of engagement at the project stage, like what the actual fence line harms are, those kinds of things. But I think upstream of that, we actually need to have kind of a broader societal conversation about what gets to use CDR. So like the fact that I can go purchase CDR credits and apply them to whatever I want is probably not that helpful from a global perspective. And it means that a community that's being asked, are you willing to live with the fence line consequences and potentially fence line benefits of this project? They don't know what it's for. I think people react very differently to being asked to sacrifice something if they believe in what it's for. And just watching this with renewable energy deployment, seeing a giant wind farm that's for someone else to use or something along those lines. Like around me, a lot of it is big renewable energy that gets deployed for basically for companies to say that they're carbon neutral, because up here in Indiana, we don't have much of a renewables portfolio. But in general, I think people react pretty negatively to things where they don't think that the harms are worth it. And without an upstream conversation about what this is actually for, I don't think we're going to be that successful with project level consultation.
And I think,
oh, no, go ahead, Jessica.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to add to that just because I agree with everything that Emily said. And what we found, one of the first things when we were kind of talking with people is that the source of the CO2 really, really made a difference for how people thought about the project. And so they were not excited about having and kind of hosting this CO2 storage hub if it was going to kind of keep fossil fuel industry solvent. They were much more interested in using it for drawdown emissions or for hard to abate sectors like cement, which are also locally present. And so for our case, we saw that the state of Colorado has a really helpful energy office that was providing some of the state level guidance and policy priorities in terms of carbon storage and which applications they were going to be the most supportive of. The other thing that was really important in terms of thinking about consultation is who is actually running the process. And so I think what happened a lot of time on a project level is that you have the project proponents running a consultation project, and they're not kind of neutral third-party brokers who are best positioned to do that kind of work. And so our energy office actually hosted a lot of public listening sessions and workshops that I think helped us zoom out from just the project level questions related to us. The other thing that was really clear in talking with people working on different projects is that this whole process goes a lot more quickly when communities have already done the planning work ahead of time, instead of having to quickly mobilize a lot of time and resources and people to all of a sudden provide input on a new project that's come to them. So we've come across lots of examples in which there are already established organizations that were doing local and regional planning, and they already laid out kind of what their process was for making decisions, what their priorities were, what benefits they wanted to see, and then what risks they were most concerned about mitigating. And then the other thing that we tried using in our project a lot was moving away from consultation to think about consent. So with consultation, you can say that you've done it, but move forward with the project anyway. And a lot of times when you're thinking about consultation, it tends to shape questions and discussion to be about yes, no, instead of under which circumstances. And so for us, we were really interested in not presenting an already fully designed carbon storage project, but to really open that up to see if we could kind of change some of the decisions based on local priorities. Would that then be something that they were more excited about instead of just kind of asking for a yes or a no?
Just to jump in, and I fully agree with Emily and Jessica and all their points. And so I just kind of want to build off of them with two additional points. I think first, engagement is a lot of different things. And so these ideas of like engagement being one thing, whether it's early consultation or informed consent later on, I think leads to a lot of these misunderstandings that engagement is going to necessarily be burdensome or slow down a process or is incompatible with deployment speeds. And so when we think about things like co-decision making, things that actually enable better process, ultimately that actually helps deployment or demonstration projects be successful. And so I think it gets to this idea that I think the tension between a desired speed and good engagement being at odds, I think it's just false, right? I think ultimately good engagement is what allows projects to succeed and to serve communities and to actually serve climate benefits in the end. And so without these processes, I think you're ultimately making political mistakes around technology deployment. And so I think getting past these ideas of urgency and governance being at odds with each other, I think we need to have a more constructive conversation around how do we actually build governance that enables technology to serve the public good at the speeds that we want.
So we've got several great questions coming in from the audience, and I want to pick up on something you all said and also combine it with an audience question. So we've been talking a bit about what it means to view CDR as a resource that's limited and think about a resource allocation question or those limited capacities. I'm wondering, if you could say a little bit more about what that might mean, practically speaking, in terms of governance or policy mechanisms. And then we had a question from the audience about what's the potential for requiring emitting industries to remove the CO2 equivalents of their historic emissions. I guess kind of a carbon take back obligation type of policy. Would you see that as something that would A, have a good potential, and B, address the resource allocation challenge? Or are there other policies that you're thinking of when we talk about that resource allocation constraint?
Happy to go in our little circle order again, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think from a resource allocation perspective, one of the things that always jumps out at me when I start doing analysis of this, especially when it shows up in like, state policies and things like that, where people are playing with something like a carbon take back obligation or a carbon management strategy that allows people to either reduce or remove or something like that, is just how rarely people actually put the important figures of merit into some of these policies. And by important figures of merit, I think for me, a lot of the time that's electricity use or land use. So, for example, I had an undergrad working with me a couple of years ago. We were kind of curious. I lived in Georgia at the time, and Georgia Power had been playing around with these ads that basically suggested that they were going to meet their net zero requirements using carbon removal, using biomass-based carbon removal specifically. And so there were all these ads that were showing how they were going to keep their coal plants running and then also use trees or something like that. And what we basically showed was you would need, for one of their plants, you would need to forest literally every non-building covered piece of land in the county that plant was in order to offset 1 year of its emissions 30 years into the future. So it would take 30 years to offset this year's emissions, and you would have to keep that land forested in perpetuity. Like, this is absolutely unrealistic. Similarly, with some of the state policies that we've looked at from a resource allocation perspective, you see some of the potential proposals around using something like direct air capture, basically barreling toward using 10, 50, 80% of the state's electricity capacity within the next decade. It's just not something people think about. And so there's this kind of impression that's like, oh, it's $1,000 a ton. That's a lot, but we can manage it without thinking about, this would actually like triple, quadruple, whatever, at whatever level you're talking about CDR, the kinds of energy intensities that we're speaking about here are, I don't think, discussed enough. At the same time, another, not to go on my critique rant today, but I think another thing where we don't see people talking explicitly about some of these figures of merit is in decarbonization pathway research more generally. There's a lot of talk there also in terms of, to achieve net zero, what are your costs per megawatt hour, those kinds of things, without talking about how big the system needs to be. Some of the pathways for the United States suggest that we need, without accounting for direct air capture or other CDR mechanisms, that you might need somewhere between 5 and 8 terawatts of installed capacity by mid or end, I think mid-century for most of the ones that I'm thinking about right now. For those that are not super familiar with this, we currently have about 1 terawatt of installed capacity. So you're talking, before talking about DAC, 5 to 8 times the size of the electricity system we have now. There's not a world where you're not taking away from some other use if you're talking about using so much power for something like direct air capture. And so from a resource allocation perspective, I don't actually think it's as simple as thinking about this from a ton for ton perspective. It actually needs to be much more high level of who's required to mitigate, who's required to do something, who's allowed to actually have residual emissions, and then where are we going to start plugging in this CDR eventually in order to get to where we're going? Because it's not the kind of situation where you can make individual discussion or individual decisions at the margin here. It's just the system is too big, and the difference between 1 gigaton of CDR needed and 30 gigatons of CDR needed or something along those lines is so enormous that it actually qualitatively changes what the future might look like in ways that I don't think we're addressing significantly enough. So the resource allocation question, I think, is not just at the margins, how are we spending money? It's literally like, are we going to double or triple the land use that we're devoting to electricity systems because of this, so that we can let a cement plant keep operating or whatever it is? Like, that's the kind of scale we're talking about here.
I think to kind of bring this kind of to a very concrete level. So the place where our study is located is the area surrounding Pueblo, Colorado. It's historically marginalized area. It's about 60% of the people who live there are Hispanic. Pueblo has shouldered most of the environmental burdens for the development of Colorado's heavy industry. And folks there already pay, I think, a third more for their personal electricity than do other people in the state, even though they're home to a large coal-fired electricity power plant that's scheduled to go offline by 2031. And so what this meant is that when we are having discussions about a potential CO2 storage system, and when we were having discussions about potential direct air capture system, they were looking at electricity use in addition to the land use. And so it ended up being a situation in which the only plausible proposal for a DAC system also involved replacing the coal plant with a nuclear generating facility, which brings lots of environmental risks that they wanted to avoid in terms of thinking about their energy future. And even talking about the land use, one of the things that has happened is as the steel mill has decarbonized, they've built between 500,000 and 750,000 solar panels in order to power their arc furnaces. And so what's happening is that kind of our energy systems that kind of create disproportionate burdens are taking up more and more land and more electricity. And the other thing to keep in mind, kind of from an ethnographic perspective, is that a lot of these places are also being targeted for electricity heavy industries such as data centers and AI centers. So we have to keep that in mind in terms of thinking about how we're allocating resources.
I don't have a ton else to add to Emily's and Jessica's points. I think just one additional piece I would add is just the international context. I think often because CDR has been really constrained to a global North conversation, thinking about global South considerations in terms of, decisions that they might make, the resources that they have versus kind of the outcomes that we're striving for. And that kind of brings me to my second point of to what end, right? I think ultimately resource allocation decisions are made based on the outcome you're striving for. And I think for a lot of us, or most of us, or all of us in this conversation, the outcome is for climate benefits. But that's not true across the CDR space. Profit is largely the motivation, I think, for a lot of owners of CDR. And I think there is a tension there, right, between the profit and climate considerations. And profit doesn't necessarily mean profit from CDR, but to maintain profit and to use CDR in a context to make sure that profit is still available. And so making sure that we actually, when we think about resource allocation, are making decisions for a coordinated outcome is actually, I think, one of the hardest parts of starting that conversation, because you can't have resource allocation decisions unless you're aligned on what you're actually trying to make decisions about. So I'll just add that context and stop there.
Yeah, it's kind of a follow-up to what we were just discussing. There's a question from the audience. Is there connections being built between electricity affordability groups like ratepayer advocates and people involved in greenhouse gas removal governance work, or do those connections need to be built? What do you think?
The only connections that I've seen really are utilities basically saying CDR is a way that we're going to let you keep your cheap coal plant online, which I think is counterproductive and is not true from an affordability perspective. So I would say those connections probably do need to be made.
I definitely don't have the national and international perspective that Emily and Shuchi have, but one of the kind of connections we saw in our own kind of project here in Colorado is actually that the folks that were the most concerned about energy affordability are those advocating for thinking outside of utility scale industry electricity in general, and trying to create different sorts of renewable energy systems that are more distributed. So not kind of industrial scale projects like our own.
Yeah, so I wanted to step back a bit from the industrial carbon management that we've been talking about and ask a couple of questions that have come up around other sorts of removals. So one is that, are there particular considerations needed for community engagement and governance for non-CO2 greenhouse gas removals, like for methane, which would be unique to their application areas? Two, what guardrails might be needed for limiting land use impacts from bio-based greenhouse gas removals? And three, what considerations might be unique to marine carbon removal versus what might be the same as land-based? So if any of you want to speak either on methane removal, biological CDR, or marine CDR, I'll open it up there.
I can start. I have a few different thoughts. I think starting with marine CDR, I think is particularly challenging because the scale at which it's happening and the national governance context of some of those decisions look very different than land-based CDR. I think they're also much earlier in technology development, and whether or not they can actually result in good outcomes is a really challenging question. I will say, I think, like, broadly speaking, like, engagement has commonalities and differences across every project. And so based on the technology, the project itself, and the community being engaged, I think there are going to be inherent differences no matter what the project, even if under the same CDR technology banner. And, per what Jessica said earlier, like, who is running the project, who's paying for it, like, are all going to be parts of kind of how each individual kind of engagement opportunity gets built, that will ultimately kind of define what that's going to look like. I think for ocean CDR, I think there are more connectivities to, I think, where I work right now in solar geoengineering, in that understanding is such early stage, but scale is potentially so big. And so I think thinking about, types of engagement that are much earlier in the process, that gets to some of Emily's and Jessica's points of earlier around, you need much wider scale understanding of the thing itself before you think about project-based engagement. So things like capacity building around what the thing is, like, for different communities and regions that might need to engage with that question, I think is going to be really critical for ocean CDR, because the places that could span are so global in nature. Thinking about how to do that, I think, is actually a lot closer to thinking about solar geoengineering in some ways than land-based CDR. And so thinking about not just individual communities, but also broader sectoral spaces like civil society and local policymakers that have to start figuring out how to make decisions and recommendations around these types of technologies, is actually going to be really important to ultimately how these projects get built, and even how research is done. And that's really hard. It's incredibly hard to think about for solar geoengineering, and I think equally as hard to think about CDR because of the scales that we're talking about. So I'll stop there.
I'll talk about methane for a second. Disclaimer, I wrote the societal impacts position paper for the National Academy's thing on methane removal. And because I get to say what I want, I guess, it is my personal opinion at this point, which I think is relatively well informed, that methane destruction should never be characterized as greenhouse gas removal for a couple of reasons. The kinds of processes that we're looking at for methane destruction are, I think, pretty much universally actually mitigation measures. Anytime you have an elevated level of methane, pretty much that's coming from an anthropogenic source. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but the exceptions are things like swamps that are already sort of managing their systems. Methane has a really short half-life in the atmosphere, so there's not a global atmospheric stock in the same way that there is with CO2. And so, to simplify this a little bit, I think, and why this is, I think, an interesting conversation to have in a governance webinar, I think it's actually pretty dangerous to start talking about methane destruction as removal, the same way that we talk about carbon dioxide removal, because there's not really a remediation potential that goes beyond mitigating an ongoing emission. I get there are a couple of exceptions to that. I'm sure we can come up with a few examples, but I think by and large, what people are talking about when they start saying AMR, atmospheric methane removal, is either something along the lines of what Shuchi was talking about, where you're dealing with massive, massive systems that we don't understand all that well, where you're basically having to oxidize the entire atmosphere, or you're dealing with what are effectively point sources that if you destroy them are just, it's an easier way to mitigate that emission than mitigating it before it's released, essentially. And so I think talking about these things as climate functions when we think about governance becomes really, really important, because distinguishing between what's mitigation and what's removal, what can actually address legacy emissions versus what can't, those kinds of things actually becomes really important when we think about responsibility and resource allocation and those types of things. So the governance conversation around methane, I think, really needs to stay quite focused on the point that this is something where, yeah, destroying the emissions that are going into the atmosphere would be transformative for climate impacts. And also that shouldn't be characterized as removal that you can use to balance an ongoing emission somewhere else.
Jessica, yeah, you're good with that. Yeah. I wanted to pick up on that. So we can talk about governance needs for research, for demonstration, for deployment of greenhouse gas removal technologies. So I was wondering, in what ways do those governance needs differ, in your opinion? And there's another question from the audience, which is sort of related. They ask, can you discuss best practices for broadening participation in research for greenhouse gas removal? And is demonstration and deployment more successful if the basic research supporting these later phases is more democratic? So what's the relationship between the governance needs at these different stages? Maybe if you don't mind being on the spot, Jessica, we could start with you since you've actually been involved with participation in the research phase.
I can try. One of the things that has been really difficult and that we've taken to heart is that at this phase of the project, there's a real danger of raising expectations and asking for a lot of labor on the part of people who are already stretched thin locally to do the kinds of meaningful engagement that would be necessary for a meaningful next phase of the project. And so we've tried to be realistic about what we can offer. And because of the history and politics of the place, kind of the number one question is always about jobs. And will this sort of facility or kind of ecosystem kind of create jobs that are being lost as kind of deindustrialization happens in the other sectors. And what we were able to do kind of during this feasibility study was commit to creating economic models that would help to predict potential job creation and potential other positive economic impacts. But at this stage, a feasibility study for a carbon storage project is really drilling a couple of test wells. It's not a construction kind of phase project. And in terms of thinking about broadening participation in the research itself, one of the things that we don't often think about is bringing in different forms of expertise. So being able to have social scientists participate in a project like this helps. But really, our goal was to try to amplify and channel local expertise to the project team. And one of our biggest frustrations is because of the timing and kind of the whole application infrastructure. It's really hard to do meaningful engagement before you actually have a project that's funded. So in an ideal world, I think it would have been a lot better to have had local knowledge integrated in a more in-depth way into our actual application and kind of planning phases instead of rushing like we did to try to do that kind of once the project actually was a financial reality. So I do think that broadening participation helps to set you up to have better outcomes. But there's a lot of kind of structural features that you have to manage.
I can jump in, just a few thoughts to add. One point that I would want to reiterate here is that I made earlier is that engagement is a lot of different things. And so when thinking about engagement for research, I think there's a lot of opportunities for things like co-creation on research questions and figuring out what types of questions might serve different types of communities or sectors' needs. And kind of thinking about how kind of you can continue to engage with the same people as you move into different versions of research and like to the deployment spectrum, right? And so thinking about kind of those different types of engagement opportunities as you're moving through the spectrum, I think is just really important to consider. Another point I would also make here is that I think we often forget about kind of this foundational need for capacity building to be able to engage. And I think that's true across the research or deployment spectrum. And capacity building can be considered as a type of engagement or kind of a need prior to legitimate engagement. But it's something that I kind of just wanted to emphasize that is needed no matter the type of engagement work that you're doing for people to have access to unbiased information that can enable them to build their own perspectives in unbiased ways to have the opportunity to participate, right? Because I think often we think about participation as a short or kind of limited thing that you're doing with a set of people, but that I think often limits kind of the really vast landscape that I think people kind of come to engagement with, where they want to know that their outcomes are being used in some way or that their participation actually means something to you, either as a researcher or as a project developer. And so I think thinking about those considerations in terms of how engagement looks across the entire R&D spectrum is I think critically important to both the success of the engagement and the success of either the research or potential early project.
I think I agree. I'm a little obsessed with the idea of lay juries for policy conversations. The basic idea is you get, for these really complex things, instead of asking people to come and weigh in for 45 minutes on a super complex topic, you actually recruit people to kind of be very, very intensively informed about something and kind of come to some conclusions, not on behalf of everybody, but just to sort of get additional representation. All that aside, though, I think the thing that I do maybe want to add is that broadening participation on the research side is really valuable if that research is being deployed for good things. I think there is a little bit of a history we need to be cautious of that in captured industries, broadening participation can be a way of sort of sanitizing and using those people as spokespeople to their own communities. And so recruiting folks, especially from underrepresented backgrounds, to do research in areas that their communities are potentially rightfully suspicious of, I think has been used as a pretty dangerous tool in the past. And so if CDR is going in a direction that is good, then yeah, I think that's great. If it's something where, you know, a whole bunch of oil companies are basically like, we need more people from communities that are suspicious of our actions to be participating in this research so that they can be on our flyer, I'm not super excited about that.
Yeah. And in the spirit of not just critiquing all the time, but also building, also I wanted to point us to a really good resource that we've been using in terms of thinking about how to make engagement not so much a plastic word that can mean anything to anybody, but really has some teeth to it. And I think it gets used a lot, but I think it's worth saying out loud. So it's the spectrum of engagement, kind of from tokenizing to community ownership. And it comes in lots of different versions. The one we use is from facilitating power. And it kind of takes the ladder of participation and applies it specifically to these kinds of projects. And one of the concrete ways that we've used it is with our team as a whole. And because it's very easy for everyone to say that they're committed to engagement in some way, but then when they actually have to choose where they are on this ladder, you end up seeing that you have really different priorities and really different goals in terms of what you want that engagement to do. So that's a nice resource to help think through kind of what engagement can be in more and less meaningful ways.
So we've had a few questions about scale, which relates to what we were just talking about. There's the question of to what extent should carbon removal governance be multi-level in terms of local, state, and federal? Are there specific roles that are most appropriate to each level? We also had the question around the resources needed for these upstream conversations or capacity building. Governance takes money and resources. And the question here was, is there a role for community-led or bottom-up governance in this space? I assume maybe absent federal resources. But I would also say that maybe we don't want to put extra burdens on strapped communities too, right? So how do we navigate these scalar opportunities / responsibilities at this particular moment? Any thoughts there?
I can start. I mean, those are really, really big questions. So I'll start with some like high level thoughts, and then pass it to my co-panelists. I mean, I think first and foremost, like there are necessarily things that governance pertains to that different levels of governments are going to have to think about. I feel like outside of local, state, national, there's also international, and I think CDR doesn't really exist outside of an international buy-in. And so excluding that from kind of the types of government engagement we're going to need, I think we lose a lot of, I think, context for CDR. So I just would want to add that in as well. I mean, I think the challenge right now is what do you do in the context of a completely different national framework? And I don't think we have any answers for that yet, right? I think when we have national institutions that have completely changed the starting point for where we're trying to build off of to get to good governance, I think it changes the answers to what the role is for states, communities, and international institutions to such a point where I deeply struggle with that. Because if we don't have the national infrastructure for states and local governments to engage with, how do we have successful governance? And I think those are questions that the community has to start grappling with in seriousness immediately, because even if, let's say, we were able to build back institutions at a national level, the durability of them is no longer secure. And so how we think about democratic, deliberative, good governance, the context has just completely shifted. And so like you can see, like I'm struggling with that deeply right now. Of like I don't actually know what good answers are anymore. And I think that's something that we need to, one, recognize in CDR, and to start figuring out what exactly that means in terms of how decisions get made and where people can be part of those processes.
I think it would be helpful to bring in a previous conversation we had preparing for this webinar. I think it's important to keep in mind this question of scale and governance alongside kind of this historic low in terms of trust for governance in general. And because it is not just kind of formal government institutions and agencies and processes where we see a lack of trust, but we also have historic lack of trust in corporations, in unions. In our own case, there's more resiliency in terms of trust for institutions of higher education to be more of a trustworthy broker. I'm not sure if that's going to stay, kind of given what's happening nationally in terms of how higher ed is being politicized. One of the things that my colleagues who were working in DAC spoke highly of, but the three of you know much more about, were these phase 0 grants for direct air capture hubs. And that funded a lot of that early stage, meaningful, not kind of general engagement, but really capacity building and visioning work from places that were considering DAC hubs.
Yeah, and I think really quickly, I appreciate so much when people are trying to kind of bootstrap out of bad large scale governance stuff. I don't think you can in this situation. Like the kind of current that we're all flowing in is that this is developing as a profit-driven industry. I'm one of the academic representatives on the board of a trade organization for CDR, and I think one of the things that is really interesting when talking to some of the companies a lot is like even the ones that are trying to make good decisions can't really, and like I don't think you can do good CDR right now, given that there are all of these questions about who gets to control where the resource is going and all that sort of thing. And that's really, really frustrating because people that are trying really, really hard are still forcing their way upstream. I guess my point there is that the action item is that this is actually a political project in a really big way, and that's frustrating and scary and hard. But also, I don't think this is the kind of thing where a couple of people or even many communities making good decisions locally is going to be able to overcome a lot of the bigger issues. This does need to be bigger, I think.
Well, we're almost at the end of our time together. I'd like to invite you all to share 1 minute of closing reflections. There's a lot of great things we didn't get to. Those involve permitting reform, moral hazard, social life cycle analysis. If you have 1 minute prepared on any of those, feel free to share, or just reflections from this conversation today. Maybe we can go in reverse order and start with you, Shuchi.
Oh man, those were like three entire different like PhD pieces right there. I mean, I guess I mean I'll say one thing on moral hazard in that I actually think CDR is a good example of moral hazard right now. In actuality, where I think the way we're making decisions in a political context without climate considerations, with the backdrop of this current administration, was really problematic. And I don't have a good answer for kind of thinking our way out of that, but I think is an extremely challenging governance consideration when we're trying to figure out what the best ways forward are for the CDR space. I think from just kind of a high level perspective, governance is one of the hardest things in like that we can do. Good governance is one of the hardest things we can do. The political context for this work is getting harder and harder with every passing minute. And I think just recognizing that is really critical. That doesn't mean that I'm still optimistic and I'm still idealistic. And I think doing good work on capacity building in other countries, in other places, can actually build a better community to help answer this question. And that's really why a lot of my work is focused in that space. And I hope a lot more people start getting involved with these really challenging questions.
I don't think I have anything profound to say except that I see the need for a different national discussion and process for how we manage this. At the same time, I don't want to fully give up hope on the project level. And it's been very exhausting. And I feel like I have been living some of the contradictions that a lot of people on this call have written about in their work, between trying to create an otherwise out of kind of what's really becoming a for-profit industry. And the work is difficult, but I think it's meaningful, and I hope that we have a good opportunity to do right by the opportunities that are being presented to us, and that thinking about where kind of these national and state level policies end up meeting kind of people on the ground is really crucial to any of these things moving forward. It's been funny to watch as someone who studied mining and oil and gas, and kind of conflicts there, to see similar conflicts over permitting and a lack of procedural justice come out in kind of these large scale renewables. And so I think there's an opportunity to learn from all of these different sectors about how to get participation right and meaningful.
I'll jump on my own field for a second. So I'm a life cycle assessment methodologist. SLCA is not ready for this, and it's not the right tool anyway. If you are in Indiana in the spring, come by my class, and we'll talk more about why. But life cycle assessment is designed as a product level evaluation tool, and part of the reason social life cycle assessment really hasn't advanced is because a lot of social scientists, I think, legitimately don't think it's a useful tool, and so it's kind of, I'm trained both as an engineer and as a sociologist, and the engineers are very excited about SLCA, and the sociologists are like, why are you wasting your time on this? So that's my side comment. I think as like a closing comment, we haven't screwed this up yet. We're getting there, certainly. I'm not super excited about that, but we haven't actually screwed this up yet. I think there is still an opportunity to do good governance. And I think the really sobering breaks with a lot of institutions and the way that we govern systems and all of that sort of thing are giving people more awareness that stuff can change really quickly. The direction of that change is not exciting to me at the moment, but I think it is useful to remember that we can change things. We can change our institutions. That's really, really hard work. CDR is not quite at the point where all hope is lost. And so I think it's still worth trying to make it better.
Well, I'd like to thank all our panelists for their time today, the audience for their thoughtful questions, and also the National Academies for convening this conversation. Our next webinar will be Tuesday, September 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern, and will focus on life cycle assessment and techno-economic analysis of emerging greenhouse gas removal technologies. So please join then, and thank you for joining us today.